stillness. Near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul. Oh, it's restless and running my soul. Oh, it's restless till I find my rest in thee.
My name is the Reverend Justin McIntosh. I'm the rector of St. Paul's Ivy.
And I am Father Nick, or the Reverend Nicholas Forti, rector of the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia.
And Nick, it's good to be with you talking about the secular over these weeks. We're going to be thinking together about what it means to be a Christian in our time, in this secular age, what we mean by the phrase a secular age.
Yeah, and we had talked about that title, I guess, back a few months ago when we first started, dreaming this up. And more recently, it struck me that I almost want to change it to, instead of being Christian in a secular age, to something like being pilgrims or pilgrims in a secular age. And part of that is, to kind of introduce this idea of kind of sojourning through this age, not both being here in it, but also not being of it in a sense, which I think as Christians we're called to be, but also as a kind of homage to C.S. Lewis, who I think had taken on some of the very themes we're going to talk about, even as far back as the first thing that he wrote after his conversion to Christianity, which is the Pilgrims Regress, which obviously is a title that plays on, and the whole thing in some sense plays on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But it's his regress from, in a sense, kind of a full immersion in the secular age into the Christianity of his childhood, in a sense. Now become a kind of mature Christianity. Anyway, that's a little bit to the side, but what it means is that when I sent Justin the notes for today's discussion, I added being Christian in a secular age, a pilgrimage, and so I'm sticking with that.
I like that. We're journeying to a destination in this process, and I think another thing we can say about what we're trying to do here is to think about the assumptions and values and notions that are kind of lurking in the background for all of us that we don't really think about a lot, maybe ever, and really using this time to kind of shine a light on them and think about where did they come from, and how are they shaping the way that we look at everything in our life, not just our religious life, and we'll unpack what that means, but how we make our way through everyday experiences, how we journey through them. So hopefully we'll find ourselves being challenged in that way, and maybe thinking about other ways to conceive of our world in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So this first session, and we'll have 4 altogether, where we have this, Justin and I have this conversation on certain topics to do with our theme. And then we invite you all to join us on Wednesday evenings for a Zoom discussion. We'll do 4 of these, so 4 videos and 4 Zoom meetings over the next few weeks. And so we'll be able to get kind of deeper into some of these topics and unpack them a little bit more. But what we thought for this first session is let's just kind of explore this secular age. And so we called this mapping our present secular age. And I'll be honest with you, that's not an entirely new or creative title. We've actually stolen that. And now, so maybe I'll say a little bit about the sources. We're going to be using various sources. Justin and I have both read quite a bit on this topic, and there's quite a bit out there, stuff we haven't read too. We'll be drawing on multiple sources, and most of these we'll mention them as we go along, or we'll include maybe a bibliography for those who are interested in reading more. But I suspect the two main sources that we'll be drawing on that have been very formative for me, and I suspect for you too, Justin, are a book by Charles Taylor called A Secular Age, and then a book by James K.A. Smith called How Not to Be Secular. And Charles Taylor is a philosopher from Canada. I think he's Roman Catholic. And James K. Smith, or Jamie Smith, is a philosopher at Calvin College, also from Canada originally, but he's Calvinist in background. His book, How Not to Be Secular, is really a kind of guide to reading Taylor's A Secular Age. And so I often suggest, to folks, if you're going to read Taylor's A Secular Age, which, let me just grab that real quick.
Yeah. It's a tome.
It's a tome. That's right. It's so here it is right here. This is the hardback edition. There are paperback now, and it's let's see. I'm not going to count the notes. So if I don't count the notes, it's just about 800 pages, and as you can see, not small pages. It's a tome. It's worth a read. It's definitely, if you can work your way through it, it's worth a read. But I suggest reading Jamie Smith's book either before or actually I read it afterwards and found that very helpful. And the nice thing about Jamie's book, much thinner.
Yeah.
It's easy. So, maybe you'll never pick up Taylor. If not, you can still pick up Jamie Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular, which is only about 140 pages. And he really distills some of the key insights that Taylor has and the key arguments Taylor makes, and applies them particularly to questions that we might have in the church or as Christians. Taylor is not so focused on that issue, but Jamie Smith is. Did you want to say something about these two books, Justin?
Just to affirm that, you'll get this reference when we were children. There were things called Cliff Notes that gave us a guide to magisterial works, and we might think of Jamie's book as a kind of Cliff Note version or a roadmap for Charles Taylor's book. I read somewhere one reviewer described A Secular Age as like wandering through a medieval town. It is itself a kind of journey to read this book, and it's inviting you into an experience. What does it feel like to live in our time, our secular age? And what's helpful about Jamie's book is, again, it sort of distills these core concepts into a shorter book, and it has a great glossary at the back too, because one of the things that Taylor does is he has a lot of jargon, technical language, words that he creates to kind of capture this series of phenomena that make up the contemporary secular age. And Jamie unpacks all that for us. So definitely check out Jamie's book either before or after, and if the tome intimidates you, then start with this one here, Jamie's book.
Yeah, definitely. And I mentioned that also because we will be stealing, and by stealing, obviously we're citing, but stealing a lot of stuff from these books. That, you know, in a sense, we'll be reflecting on a lot of the ideas in these books. But even this calling this session "Mapping Our Secular Age," you know, comes directly from the introduction of Jamie's book.
Right.
The first section of which is mapping this present age. So
Right.
we weren't being super creative. We were, you know, but you know, why reinvent the wheel, right?
Exactly.
Um,
And we think that the reason we're drawing so heavily from these two works, ultimately from Taylor, is because Taylor's book, which I think came out in 2007, is a work that is seminal in the field. It's a work that has changed the conversation. It has spawned many responses in articles and books, and the language that Taylor uses has become kind of common coinage in discussions about what it means to live in our time. And so this is really the place to start. This is a work that's going to endure, that people are going to talk about for decades to come. Um, you know, it's been what, 14 years, and people are still engaging this book, still reading it, still studying it. So it truly is a masterpiece in that sense, and that's why we really want to draw from it for this discussion.
that's right, and it's you know, it's also important to point out that it's not an apologetic for Christianity. That's not at all what Taylor's doing, and folks outside of the church, at least as much, if not more, are studying this text. I mean, this is it wasn't meant, it wasn't directed towards Christians in particular. It wasn't meant as a text for the church. It is, as Justin's saying, seminal for just this field of study, this kind of building a philosophy of the present age, but also you know, even being engaged by social scientists and that kind of thing, because of um, just the degree of learning and the depth of scholarship and the insights that are in it.
And it's a pretty cool thing to come across a work like this that is sort of approaching your own time, your own life, your own experiences, as an anthropologist might approach a different culture or a different time. So it can be really helpful to sort of see your life and your intellectual framework unpacked and explained. I know for me, it has helped me understand more why I kind of intuitively think certain ways about the world, and I think that's really helpful. I think that's how we grow and come to a deeper understanding of ourselves.
So we've been banning about this word secular already
Mhm.
quite a bit. It's
Yeah.
in our title. It's what we're talking about. But maybe we should begin by kind of focusing in on what this word means and how we're using it. There's actually multiple different ways of using this word and have been throughout history. We won't get into all that. Uh, you know, maybe in our discussion, our Wednesday night discussions, if y'all want to, we can kind of delve in a little bit more. But I'd like to just kind of very briefly talk about this word and how we're using it, but where it
Mhm.
came from first.
Mhm.
And the first place I'd like to turn us to is the Lord's Prayer, actually, the doxology of the Lord's Prayer, which you might not think that this word comes from the doxology affixed to the end of the Lord's Prayer, but it actually is, in a form, it is there.
Yeah.
Um, and that doxology, of course, is "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever."
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, I've noticed, by the way, Justin, I don't know if you've noticed this. We say forever and ever. Other denominations, I guess, consider that just a mouthful, and
Yeah, I have noticed
not
that.
at all.
Yeah.
And you say forever. Uh,
Yeah.
but we make sure we get that ever and ever, just in case you were thinking it was just one.
On and on and on.
That seems to be an Episcopalian thing, but anyway, or Anglican. This is a translation from the Greek. And the Greek is something like hoti su estin he basileia kai he dunamis kai he doxa es tois ionos. And this ionos is what gets translated as forever and ever in English. But that Greek line, when the New Testament gets translated into the Latin, you get the Vulgate. When the liturgy moves from in the West from the Greek into the Latin, it has to be translated before it gets to English. It goes from Greek to Latin. And Justin, you're the Latin guy. I wonder.
Sure. Yeah. In Latin, it's quia tuum es regnum et potestas et gloria in saecula. And saecula is the key part there, translating ionas from the Greek. So you can probably already hear there, Nick, that we're saying something that sounds a lot like the English word secular, saecula.
Yeah.
And it's used here as forever or age or epic.
Right. So I think that's important, is to point out that even though we tend to translate this as forever, and maybe a little bit in a little bit we'll talk about why we end up going in that direction. It's more common if we were to find this outside of the Lord's Prayer and just a normal sentence, to translate it as age, as you said, or as era, or as epoch, or whatever. That it's a temporal word typically in the ancient languages, in Greek and then in Latin, denoting a time span. I don't have, because I'm a poor parson. I don't have a dollar on me. Do you happen to have a dollar on you, Justin?
I don't actually. I hardly ever use cash, but that's part of being in the secular age, right?
Yeah. So if you have a dollar and you pull it out, you'll notice that there are among the different words, especially there's several different Latin phrases on there. Of course, e pluribus unum, but there's also novus. Well, why don't you say it?
Sure. Novus ordo secularum. So that's sort of a new world order, or a new order of ages, something of that sort is how you might translate it.
Right. So there's a possibility now of translating as world, but often, again, the root of our word secular, the Latin root, is translated as age.
Yeah, definitely the most literal translation would be a new order of ages.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, so Justin, I don't know if this occurred to you, but thinking about that, this made me question, why does Taylor, go the redundancy route and title his book A Secular Age, right? If secular is just this, comes from this Latin root for age, I mean, in a sense, it's like he's saying,
an age.
Right, age.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think it shows that the meaning of this word has obviously evolved, and how we use it today in 2021 is not what was meant by it in the past. And I think one of the things that Taylor does very well in his book is unpack the kind of different meanings that secular has had at different times, and even maybe the different meanings we mean by it now.
Mhm.
What do we really mean when we're saying the word secular?
Yeah. It's interesting that I remember when I first kind of came across this word, it was when I was a teenager.
Mm.
And, I was raised in a um, very nominal Roman Catholic household. So, I mean, maybe we went to church on Christmas Eve for midnight mass, or maybe we went to Easter Sunday mass, but never both in the same year. You know what I'm saying? Um, but I had, especially by the time I was in middle school, early high school, I had a lot of friends who were members of evangelical churches. They would have me come with them to their small groups, which were called cell groups. That should have scared me away to begin with. But anyway, I some really great friendships came out of that, and it those experiences helped me to kind of come to understand my own faith and work through some of that. But it was in those cell groups or those small groups that I first heard this word secular, and in that context, it was at a burning. Uh,
Mm.
we were being invited to bring all of our secular music. This
Yeah.
at that time mostly cassette tapes, but some CDs too, and burn them. You know, by these more evangelical, not just evangelical, but also more fundamentalist kind of churches where music that wasn't quote unquote Christian music
Right.
was considered somehow dangerous or bad, something to be gotten rid of. At the very least, it was an impediment to discipleship, and so that was when I first actually ever came across this word. I wonder, do you remember when you first heard it?
Well, I had a different upbringing than you, at least in that respect. I think the first real sense I had of this word was distinguishing kind of the public versus the private, or religious versus non-religious. And probably in the context, if I had to guess, I can't remember for sure, but civics or something like that, talking about the separation of church and state, or the separation of religion and the secular. And I think that is how I hear the word used most often. Um, Even today, and certainly in Northern Virginia, where I grew up, there was a sense of keeping a distance between the religious and the secular. And then the source of kind of controversy and tension was about how much of the religious do you allow in the secular, or what's the boundary between the two. And in the United States, we have a more fluid boundary, let's say, than a country like France, which is known for trying to rid the public or the secular of any reference or any sign, any symbol of religion, whether it might be as simple as wearing a hijab, or wearing a cross or something of that sort. So I think often when we hear the word secular, that's kind of what we're thinking, is that it's sort of the public common domain, and it's separate from the religious life, which is something else that you can kind of do on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's so interesting to me that in my context growing up, south of Richmond, you know, maybe out in the boonies for some people, it took the form of you've got to watch out for the encroachment of secular music or secular things on your Christian discipleship. For you, it
Right.
sounds like it was the other way around. The question is, how much do you let religion encroach on the secular? Interesting, different kind of dynamic around
That's
the same
that's
theme.
well put, Nick. I think that's exactly right. I think the default was to assume that the secular is something shared by all people, I mean, particularly because I grew up in a multicultural environment with people of different religious backgrounds or no religious background and so forth. And what could you share in common? Well, you could share the secular and the institutions of the secular. And people needed to keep their private religious life separate from that to some degree, for the society to function. That was the idea, at least. And I'm sure we'll want to think about that and unpack that more. But I think that was kind of the operating mode.
Yeah. So a good question, I think, for those of you who are watching, especially those who will be part of the Zoom conversation, but even if you've just kind of stumbled on this video and you're watching, and certainly feel free to put it in the comments if you like. But you know, what was your first encounter with this word secular? What did it mean? Was it more like Justin's experience? Was it more like my own? I think that's worthwhile to kind of think about and unpack for yourself, to kind of get a sense of maybe where you are in kind of coming to these questions. But if I can leave that aside for a second, I want to pick up with something you said, Justin, which is that the secular, from the perspective that you heard that word, was a kind of common space. And so I think this is an interesting thing. We've gone from way back in antiquity, late antiquity, where you know, the root word of secular denotes a time span or an age, an epoch. You know, it has this temporal character, to now a spatial character. And I want to, if I can, if you're all right with this, and please, Justin, feel free to jump in and add to the story. But I'd like to kind of give a quick overview of how we got from there to here.
Absolutely.
And that story, again, starts back in late antiquity, where we see the word secular being used. It's just a common word, or the root word, I should say, the Latin root for secular being used is just a common word for, again, an age or an epoch or a time period. But Christians started to use it specifically to refer to that age that we're in between Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension, which in some sense inaugurated or brought into the world, and I'm going to use a $3 word here that New Testament scholars like to use, proleptically, the kingdom of God, or the life of the world to come, or the age of the ages. That Christ's life, death, resurrection, and ascension began that. And now we're living in this in-between age as we await his coming again. Another $3 word is parousia, his coming in great glory. Just as we say in the liturgy, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. So we're in this age of Christ is risen and Christ will come again. And in this in-between age, that's what was known as in a sense, the secular, in preparation for the Ionios tone, Ionion, or well, I'll let you do the Latin for that.
Yeah, the schoola secularum, the age of ages. Yes.
Yeah. Or just another way of saying God's everlasting kingdom. It's really that phrase, by the way, age of ages, which we just heard in Greek, and Justin just gave us the Latin for. That's really the forever and ever, by the way, that we exactly. Poured into the doxology. But so we're in this in-between age, and that's where the word secular kind of, that's what it's meant to denote. By the time we get into medieval Christendom, there's now a discussion of two different types of clergy. So I'm sure you've all heard this language before, but you may have never stopped to think about it. Typically religious, if you speak of someone in the religious life, and I want you to think especially in terms of Catholicism, not even medieval Catholicism, but even modern Catholicism. If someone's spoken of as being in the religious life, that means that they're part of a religious order. In other words, they're a monk or a nun or a friar. And the idea is because they are dedicating themselves to an older sense of the word religion, this dedicating themselves to this their duty to God. The
Religio, right? The
yeah,
binding.
religio, right.
Yeah.
So they're dedicating themselves to prayer and work for the kingdom, and so in a sense they're participating already in the age of ages, or the everlasting kingdom, because they've renounced the world and they've entered the religious life. And so you have religious clergy. So these are monks or friars who are also priests. Not all monks and friars are priests. Not all priests are monks and friars, but there are some, and the clergy who are monks or friars are known as religious clergy.
Right.
And that stretches back to the medieval period. And these clergy are differentiated from the priests who are not part of religious orders, and the priests who are not part of religious orders, therefore, are referred to as secular. And they're secular because they're attending to folks in this age. They have not renounced the world, and they're not, their parishioners haven't renounced the world, and so their parishioners are fully immersed in the life of this age, of right now. And so secular clergy are engaged in that. Well, to make a long story short, you can already begin to see how the word is changing here.
Right.
And in a sense becoming spatialized.
Right.
So
what is the area in the world that you are functioning in? Is it
right.
the everyday, ordinary, quotidian sorts of experiences, or is it kind of binding yourself to higher norms, transcendent norms, in some ways transcending the ordinary, right? And I think this distinction, Nick, is so important because um, it's so different, isn't it, from how we use the word religious in particular. If we were to ask somebody in 1350, in Germany, an average person walking around the marketplace, maybe, a craftsman or something, are you religious? They wouldn't understand what we meant by that word at all. They would think, oh, are you saying I'm a monk? The idea that you could separate these two worlds, being a Christian and then everything else, into kind of two categories was just not conceivable, right? And it's interesting to see how different that is
Yeah.
from the biblical conception.
Yeah, and maybe in another session we can get into the discussion of how the word religion has changed, because that in itself is fascinating and tied in with all this. We now use that word as a kind of genus level term, and then you put under it different species such
Right.
as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, which that's another whole discussion.
Right.
Buddhism, whatever, and these are all different species of religion, and so you can ask somebody, what is your religion? If you ask somebody in late antiquity or in the Middle Ages, so what is your religion? That's a nonsensical question, right? You can ask, again, what's your religio, what's your duty to God and your neighbor and the city or the nation in late antiquity, or you can ask, are you a religious in the medieval context? But you can't ask, what is your religion? But that's,
And I,
oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think we will get into this more as we go through this course too, but it's worth highlighting at this moment too that there is a kind of implied hierarchy here too, in the sense that the religious, as you said, have um, moved beyond the secular, the ordinary time, and are some sense already living in the kingdom of God in its fullness, right? They're already witnessing to that. And there's a sense in the culture that this is what everyone is called to do, but lots of people are still immersed in ordinary life and ordinary needs and so forth. And in a way, the religious are doing this vicariously for the whole society. And I think that hierarchy, which gets challenged very much by the Reformation, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, but I think that hierarchy is worth noting at work in this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see, I don't want to over romanticize this, because there's definitely a tendency, especially I think for Anglicans, to over romanticize the medieval period. But um, there is an interesting way in which space and time are just approached differently in medieval Christendom.
Mm.
So that when you enter a church building, you are in a sense leaving this age and entering it, and it's designed, especially the great cathedrals, of course, designed so that you get the sense of you're leaving this age and entering into the age of the kingdom of God. You're leaving the world behind and you're entering heaven in a sense, and the whole thing draws you up to heaven, and so there's this interplay between time and space that I, you know, if I can kind of show my hand a little bit, gets flattened out as we move out of the medieval period and into the modern. But I want to be careful again, not to over romanticize, but also not to get ahead of ourselves with that.
Well, it's probably worth, just since you've gone a little bit down this road, mentioning this. I think that Taylor uses this example himself. I may get the actual dates wrong, but he says something like, from a kind of medieval point of view, Good Friday 1998 is closer to the date of Jesus's crucifixion than, say, Midsummer 1997. And that sense in which time is not simply chronological, but it has, it's sort of multi-dimensional in a way. And we'll unpack that more in these, but that I think is also related to what you were saying about kind of just a different conception of space and time.
Yeah, right. And so what we see though is as we do move into the modern period, this flattening out, this move to spatialization. I mean, this is both intellectual, but also shows up in material culture too.
Mm-hmm.
You get someone like Descartes in the early modern period mapping out a city, and it's much more in that grid pattern, as opposed to organically formed cities of the ancient and medieval world. Now we're going to start planning out cities, and they're gonna fit on a grid and that kind of thing. Uh,
Yeah.
and so you get to these two areas or spheres. On the one hand, there's the sphere of the church, or the area of the church, or you might say Christianity, or as we move further along, just religion in general, to lump in again all those religions under this genus term religion. uh, and that has one area of activity. That's one area of activity, and it becomes, in some sense, bounded by a much larger area of activity, which is known as the secular, because the secular is everything else. right? It's whatever is not in the domain of quote unquote religion or of the church. And
Right.
one of the things that we'll see in later sessions is that there's a real privatization of faith, so that as we move into the modern world, and by modern we're talking about like the year 1500 onward, so the past 500 years or so, uh, faith becomes about your personal beliefs and opinions more than anything else. And it might get expressed in certain activities, but it's more properly, that's what many scholars have pointed out as the privatization of faith.
Right.
um, that you don't see before the modern period, where faith was robust. It was not just what you thought or what you believed, but it was the how you lived in the seasons of the year, and how your whole day and week are structured by the church bells, and
Right.
when you go to mass, and all these kinds of things. All of that kind of falls away as just expressions of this privatized set of opinions or beliefs. And therefore, everything ends up really in the realm of the secular, except for these privatized beliefs and
And
their
then
expression.
now you can see where the tension emerges between church and state, right? Or between the secular, as we're using it in the modern sense, the secular and the religious. You don't need to, in a sense, think about the work of God or the church's teachings or any of that as you go to the grocery store to buy your groceries and engage in an economic activity, or maybe even as you vote and engage in the acts of citizenship, or as you go about your job, whatever your job might be. In a way, religion is supposed to be outside of all of those, almost an extracurricular activity. And that is the kind of thinking, and we're going to get it more into the sort of principles and assumptions of the modern age. But that's one aspect of our thinking that is so different than the medieval period. It would have been nonsensical that you could kind of separate these aspects of life from your religious commitment. And I think in many ways, outside of our culture, in other parts of the world, um, that still is a nonsensical idea, that your religious commitments or your understanding of the divine wouldn't have a role to play in your economic life or your political life or your social life and so forth. So in some sense, we are kind of unique, both historically and globally today, in how we in the West tend to think about this.
Yeah. Absolutely. And of course we're trying to export the way we think about
Right,
this,
right, right, right,
for
right,
better or worse,
right,
that's a different question. But
right.
um,
Yeah.
and so one of the little kind of uh, vestiges of that more medieval mindset, where even your work, let's say whatever you do is what we would consider a secular job. It has nothing to do with the church. It doesn't have to do with your religious faith. You would still be a member of a guild in the ancient world or in the medieval world, and that guild would have its own patron saint. And therefore your guild would sponsor the festivities on the feast day of your patron saint, and do all sorts of things that were connected to the church or to religious, what we would consider now religious life, even if the work that you did wasn't what we
Or
would call
religious.
right.
Yeah, right.
And one of the vestiges, at least in Episcopal churches, of these medieval guilds is that we call the folks who get the altar prepared on Sundays the altar guild, or the folks who put the flowers on the altar and in the windows of the church or whatever, the flower guild, or so on. Maybe you call the people, your acolytes, the acolyte guild, or whatever. But it certainly doesn't, in that medieval world, whatever you did, I mean, to take a modern job that they didn't have then. But if you were a trash collector, the trash collectors would all be members of the trash collecting guild and
have their own patron saint.
right,
We can only speculate about who that would be.
right. If you have ideas, again, put it in the comments. We'd love to hear. But so all of that changes now. Now these things are just part of the secular realm. Because they don't have any clear connection to those quote unquote religious beliefs or religious opinions. And all of this, as we said, really kind of, I mean, it was building up to this point, but it kind of turns a corner around 1500. Now, 1500, you'll notice, of course, is right around the time, I mean, 1492, something happened that year.
Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right?
Here we go. And, so we have what my textbook when I was a kid called the Age of Discovery.
Right.
You might also call it the Age of Colonialism. But you have the age of the development of the modern sense of the nation state right around that time. This is also the time of the Renaissance, and we should talk about that in a later session too. That's a pretty cheeky name to give for your time period. So yeah, the Renaissance, the Reformation is happening. October 31st, 1517, Martin Luther posts on the church door, the university church door in Wittenberg, the 95 Theses, which is now seen in retrospect as kind of being the spark that lights the Reformations across Europe. So just massive intellectual, economic, social, political upheaval happening right around this time, and it becomes what Charles Taylor calls a ratchet point in history. And that, he says, look, if you're using a ratchet, there's a moment where it clicks and then you can't go back, right? You can't pull it back. This is one of those ratchet points in history. Things change. And so when he adds that word, when he tacks age on to secular, which seems like a redundancy from the ancient perspective or even the medieval perspective, but he has to do that now because we think of the secular as a sphere or an area, a realm of activity, a spatialized realm of activity, and that thinking is, that way of thinking about it is, began really around 1500 and has moved on for the next 500 years to today. So in a sense, we're living in the age that sees the secular in that particular way and identifies the secular as the backdrop, the matrix in which you might have religion or you might not.
Right.
And any further thoughts about that before we get to mapping it? Because if it's spatialized, we can we can draw.
No, I think that's really helpful. And one thing we'll just say again, Taylor has a lot of jargon. He calls the first kind of secular that Nick was talking about, the medieval understanding, as kind of secular one, and then the kind of secular that I was talking about a kind of public space separated from a private space, and religion on one side, and the non-religious, all the other stuff on the other side, as secular too. And we're going to, as we unpack this, we're going to look at something that he calls secular 3, which is also, now that secular has been spatialized, how do we actually look at the world, living in this spatialized secular reality? What are the assumptions, the underlying principles? He has a beautiful phrase for this, the social imaginary, the stuff you don't even think about ever, but that's behind how you are looking at the world. We all have a social imaginary, whether we realize it or not. We all have first principles, assumptions, presuppositions that guide how we make our way through the world. And what Nick's going to lay out here for you are some of the elements of a secular three mindset, or maybe the sort of conditions of belief, the background that allows us to have a secular three mindset.
Yeah. So let's create, if we can, a map of our secular age. So in the following description, what we describe, what Justin and I kind of work together to try and describe, should sound familiar to you. This should be you're in a sense you're taken for granted world and worldview. If it's not, we've done something wrong. We've missed something, or perhaps Charles Taylor and Jamie Smith have. But there's this great passage I want to read really quick. It's not too long, from Jamie Smith's book, and it's from the introduction. It's page 2, because again, we stole this idea of mapping a secular age from Jamie, and so here's what he says. Could we imagine an existential map of our secular age that would actually help us to locate ourselves and give us a feel for where we are? Like those hucksters on Venice Beach offering maps to the homes of the stars, there is no shortage of voices hawking road atlases for a secular age. Confident new atheists, for example, delineate where we are with a new bravado. Employing a kind of intellectual colonialism, new atheist cartographers rename entire regions of our experience and annex them to natural science and empirical explanation, flattening the world by disenchantment. Graveyards of the gods are always a highlight of this tour. At the same time, and sometimes as a reaction, various fundamentalisms seem intent on selling us maps to buried treasure, pulling out yellowed parchments and trying to convince us that these dated maps tell us the truth about ourselves, about our present. But their maps are just as flat, and we feel like they're hiding something. And I'll stop there. Jamie Smith is critiquing these kind of maps of the secular, like we're about to try and give to you. And so hopefully he won't watch this and won't critique ours. But ours is really just for the purpose of trying to say, is something like this what you experience, what you sense, what you feel is the reality in which you live and move and have your being. If we do a good job of describing it, then it should feel right. I mean, it just should feel like the way things are. If we don't, then please let us know, and we'll work on it. But
The feeling word is really important, isn't it, Nick?
Yeah, that's right.
It's trying to capture a feel, creating concepts or new words to sort of to capture what does it feel like to live in the West at this moment. Um, and it may be that we're also talking about certain spaces in the West. I think we don't want to be too general about this. There may be other spaces that in the West that don't quite fit this. But if you imagine, say, urban culture in Boston or New York, or maybe where I am in Charlottesville, in a college town, that this captures Richmond, right? This captures how urban dwellers or people in this environment look at the world.
That's right. And bear in mind, when we talked about the first times that we came across the word secular, how different that was for me and for Justin. So it's not as if one map will describe it perfectly for everybody. But again, some of it at least should feel, as Justin says, should really feel right. Just the way things are. And I think, as I was thinking about actual maps, you know, Jamie Smith mentions the Venice Beach, maps of the homes of the stars, which is a great image. But the map that comes to my mind when I think of a secular age is when you first walk into the mall.
Yeah.
And at the entrance of the mall, there's a little kiosk, there's a map, and then you look for this little dot or person, and it says "You are here."
Right.
And that's what you're looking for, right? Before you look for anything else, where am I? I am here. In a sense, any map that we make, I think, in a secular age, has to begin there. It begins with the "You are here" dot. It begins with that little person. In other words, it begins with you, with the autonomous individual, the individual subject. That's the center. That's the focus of the map. I think of you all probably know this, but it's one of those things that if someone doesn't point out to you, you don't notice. If you ever look at a map of the world, look for where the center is, because there's no reason why the center in your map of the world has to be there, right? I mean, the world is, the earth is a sphere. You could pick anywhere, and that would be the center, right? But where we place the center orients the whole rest of the map and how we read the map as a whole. And if you go to other countries, and especially in other parts of the world, not nearby, you'll see that the maps are different. The center might be in a different place, representing a different orientation towards the world. And what we're saying is, in the map of the secular age, the individual is at the center. At least that's my contention. And Justin, I'd be interested in whether you think that's right.
Yeah, I do think that's right. And I think one way to think about it is to think about how much of our sense of things is based on our experience or our consciousness of reality. And this has been a move that we'll talk about more, but a move that's been central to philosophy for the last 500 years is kind of putting the individual's subjective experience of reality at the center. So when you go through life in a secular age in our time, you sort of see yourself and your experiences at the center, and you are interacting with other minds out there in the world. You have a mind and you are interacting with other minds. And this is sort of our intuitive way of looking at the world. We see things from our vantage point. We start there as we try to figure out what is true, or what's the meaning of life, or what's significant, or how it all begins in that closed framework, if you will, or that perspective.
Yeah, and my guess is you're probably thinking, well, where else would you start from?
Right.
Isn't that just the way that it is? Isn't that just natural? And that should tell you, by the way, that that's part of the fact that you are fully in this secular age. That you just assume that's the place you start. And we'll talk about other options that have been available in the past, so that you get a sense that there have been other ways of approaching things, but starting with the individual self, with the individual self subjective awareness, that's the place to begin. That's the center of the map. um, that is part of our secular age. And one of the things, Justin, that you mentioned, although as I say that, I have to stop and just say I've got to get this out of my head because it popped in my head as you were talking. So I'm just I feel like I'm hearing the words, stand in the place where you live and think about direction, wonder why you haven't before. But anyway, um, so you mentioned this kind of being closed off, and and that's something that, as you know, Taylor actually spends quite a bit of time on. He describes this as the buffered self, um, and he, you know, um, we'll talk about this more later. This is in contrast to what he identifies as the porous self. But the buffered self just means that, um, you know, you are in some sense trapped in your own subjectivity. I know that's abstract. I'm trying to think of a way to make it a little bit more concrete, but um, you know,
Well, how you look at the world is, this. We might think of it this way, from a purely secular point of view. Our brain is having these experiences, right? This sensory information is coming in, and our brain is kind of creating a movie, right? And we're observing that movie and we're interacting with it. That is a kind of secular or buffered self way of looking at the world. What is real is the construction of the world from your mind, from the workings of your brain. I mean, in one way to think about it, Nick, I think, is to think about a movie that probably most people have heard or seen, which is The Matrix, which is a movie that, in a way, only makes sense in a secular age. It is a movie of the secular age, where you begin to imagine, what if all that stuff outside of me is just a computer game, or the trickery of an evil machine? How do I know that I'm not in a computer game or a virtual reality experience? And you can see, you feel, right? Let's try to feel this, the kind of self-focus of this, and the looking out of the self in all directions. And you are then at the center. You are the heart of it. Your mind is the heart of it. um, we can pick up on the word autonomous too with this, right? Which literally means sort of self-law, or a law to yourself. And think about the way we think about ethics as very part of our buffered self or our closed system. We have that sense of what is the right thing to do, the moral sense, the natural law that we can discern through our own reason, and we let that be our guide. We don't need to, we know, like, how we should act in the world, regardless of what other people say or something. I mean, that has that sense of that we are the master of our own lives. We're the center.
yeah, yeah, that's good. And actually bringing up the Matrix, that's helpful for me,
Mm.
because I think we can actually uh, you know look at that in a few different ways to help us think about this. And so I certainly hope that if you're watching this, you've seen the Matrix.
If you haven't, go watch it.
Right. I mean, it's pretty old now by this point, but I do remember watching it for the first time and just being kind of blown away by it. But you know, in that movie, of course, when we first meet the main character Neo, he doesn't know it, but he is, in a world of illusions
Right.
that are the illusions, which is, you know, it's a pretty crappy illusion because it's just like, you know, day-to-day work life. But anyway, but that illusion is he's receiving that because you know, he doesn't know this, but his real body is plugged into a machine, and the machine is stimulating his brain in certain ways to give him this illusion, him along with everyone else, right? Almost all people, because the robots are using people as batteries. But that to me, actually, in a sense, is a little bit like, and again, we'll talk about this later, a little bit like the poorest self, right? There's something outside, external, is able to get in and you know, there's not this clear distinction between in and out, between your inner self and what's outside of you, because what's outside of you is producing your inner kind of reality. But then he gets unplugged from the machine. And when he's unplugged from it, then he becomes the buffered self. Nothing's getting in, right? And reality is just whatever is his kind of conscious awareness, without anything else kind of, like I said, getting in there and messing with that. And so in some sense, it is a really good kind of picture of how we see ourselves. We can plug in or plug out, right? Of interacting with ideas, with other people, with other things. We are the gatekeepers. This is part of the buffered self. We're the gatekeepers of whatever we're going to let in and whatever we're going to let out. Right? You don't know who I am unless I reveal who I truly am. Right? This kind of language, even, you don't find in medieval texts or ancient texts of who I truly am is only known to me, and only I can reveal it to you because it's inside of me. That's the buffered self. I have not seen Being John Malkovich. Have you seen that?
I think I've watched scenes of it, but I'm not sure I've actually ever watched the whole movie.
I think, and
I
I could be
can't speak
completely
on it.
wrong. I haven't seen it, so I could be way off. But I think in that movie, people are able to somehow get inside of John Malkovich's head or John Malkovich's mind and control him, right? They can be him, and so he loses his autonomy, and is being influenced. That's the poorest self. And again, we'll talk more about that. We don't act. I mean, that sounds like a nightmare to us, right? We don't believe that. You do hear, you know, every now and then, you know, you get ideas of well, maybe we still believe in, some people still believe in the possibility of demon possession, but typically we think what's inside of us is inside, and it only comes out if we express it, and nothing comes in unless we allow it. Philosophically, and again, we can get more into this in a later session. You really see this, and Justin, I heard you kind of talking about this without actually dropping the name. I'm going to drop the name and try and sound smart, but this is Kantian philosophy. Right. The Kant's really the one who maps this. Immanuel Kant is really the one who maps this out and gives us a philosophical basis, in a sense. I mean, he's not the only one. There's certainly others like Descartes, like John Locke, but Kant, perhaps in the most comprehensive way, gives us a philosophical basis for the buffered self. And here's something that I'm going to throw out there. You may never have read Kant, but you think like Kant. He's one of those people who's been so influential, right, on the way we think that you can't help but think like Kant, at least to an extent. And that's part of this mapping of a secular age.
Maybe worth just saying a little bit quickly on Kant to orient people. So he's late 18th century German philosopher. He was a professor, sort of the beginning really of academic philosophy. And maybe the simplest way to think about his main view on how we know things is to recognize that for him, the world as it actually is not accessible to our individual minds. That the world as it actually is gets processed through our apparatus, our mental apparatus, categories like time and space and so forth, and cause and effect, and kind of constructed inside our head, if you will. And that's what we experience in the world. And in many ways, this is actually how scientists today will talk about our reality, right? We don't really experience the world. We experience the world as transferred and transmitted through our sensory apparatus and through the way that our brain takes the neurological data, those neurons firing, and kind of creates something, right? In a way, it's a very similar kind of thinking, just to show the influence of Kant, even in how scientists today understand the brain and what the brain is doing.
Yeah, and this might just seem like, well, obvious, right? This is just
Right.
but you can go back and you can read someone like St. Thomas Aquinas and his view of how we come to know things, and it's very different. And it involves the you know, apprehending the essence, the actual essence of a thing, or the form of a thing, coming into our minds through our senses, so that there's a continuum between the things outside of us and the ways that we know those things, or our inner kind of thoughts. uh, there's a kind of a thread of continuity, and Kant comes along and snips that thread in a sense.
Right.
And that's the buffer itself, and that's well, we can talk more about that. I don't want to belabor that point, but it is important, I think,
Yeah.
as we
And,
think.
and I probably should make one qualification too, that we'll want to get into as we go through this, which is just that even scientists, when we tend to think, this is part of the secular age thinking too, that scientists are sort of like the new authorities of our age, and what they say about X, Y, and Z is absolutely the case. It's true. And what's important to remember is that even scientists, in their work, are operating with a certain intellectual framework and certain assumptions. And these are it's not the case that certain assumptions are right and other ones are definitely wrong, right? As in, we know that there's evidence for this and there isn't for that. These are just sort of the frames that we use, and you can do science with another frame, right? Just as legitimately. And I think that's something that's worth naming, because that's not always how we think about it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that clarification. I think that's super important. You know, often scientists don't have philosophy backgrounds, and so they don't think philosophically about what they're doing. They
Mm,
just do what they're doing and work within the categories they're given. And that's important to keep in mind. Uh, Finally, because we need to move, move further into the
mm,
map, but there's the authentic self. Authenticity, Taylor tells us, is super important. It's really important for our secular age. And by authenticity, what he means is not simply accepting the story you've been told, the tradition you've received, but questioning for yourself, developing your own answers, developing your own meaning in a sense. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Uh, I There was a Marcus Borg quote I was trying to remember because it just sums this up perfectly. And I remember reading it on his website back in the late 90s or early aughts. And so I went back, and of course, the quote's not there, and somebody's completely revamped his website. I don't know if that happened after he passed or before. But anyway, I couldn't find the quote, but it goes something like this. And this will not be the quote itself, but kind of gets at the same thing. He says, he said in that quote something to the extent of, you know, you have to question the traditions you receive and think critically about them, and think critically about your place in society. Otherwise, you will simply live out the role society has set for you.
Mm.
Uh, and so that quote, you'll be inauthentic, you know,
Right.
is essentially what he's saying. And if you want to be authentic, you've got to question, and you've got to make these decisions for yourself. Free will is very important in this. And you know, this stretches again, this stretches all the way back 500 years. This stretches back to Kant, who said something similar. He said, you know, he had read Justin's favorite philosopher, David Hume, and said Hume woke him up from his dogmatic slumber, that is from the dogmatisms he had inherited. And he wrote an essay, What is the Enlightenment? And essentially says in that essay, well, the Enlightenment is not taking anything on tradition, but rigorously questioning every tradition and figuring things out for yourself.
Yeah, I think doesn't it say the motto is "think for yourself" or something along those lines in
Right,
that
right.
essay?
Yeah,
That's what it means to be a grown up, to have
right.
matured. And children are those who don't think for themselves, quote unquote, but listen to authority or tradition. Tradition literally just being from the Latin, that which is handed on. So, you know, you don't subscribe to that. You come up with something new and authentic for yourself. Um, so maybe we could summarize then that the self here at the center of our map in a secular age is autonomous, is a law unto itself, right? Has a sense of how it should live, its instincts, its whatever. It it is the center that looks out, and its experiences are what's real, in some ways more authentic, its interior life, its subjective life. And you can choose whether to share that with others or open yourself up to other ideas, but you're kind of constructing and living out the truth within yourself in this kind of buffered self, and you can control the gates. That is sort of what it means to live in this time and place as a self.
Yeah, great summary. So, Justin, let's kind of spread out then. So we
Yeah.
know you are here now. Where is here? Let's move
Right.
out to the here.
What's in the rest of the mall? Yes. What
Yeah.
flows from that?
Right,
Yeah.
right. So what do you see around us?
Well, I think a couple of things that are going to happen in this perspective, and some of these also flow out from uh, scientific discoveries over the last couple hundred years. I think one thing we want to emphasize is that while we are the center in a secular age, we can feel very small as well. And you might hear people say that, or you might have felt that yourself. I feel very small. Well, in part, that's because we've discovered through our learning about the world that the material world, at least, and we'll want to think more about what reality really is and whether the material is all there is. But the material world is huge, right? So, you know, Nick, we discovered in the 20th century that there's not just one galaxy, there are just tons and tons of galaxies and many stars, right? And that things are really old, that our universe is 13 billion plus years old. And that has created a sense that even though we're kind of looking out on all of that and our experiences and our arterial life is the center, there's a big vastness. The terrain is enormous. The mall is enormous, right? That we are operating in. It's less cozy, if you will, right? And I think that's a big change, and we'll want to think about that.
And not only that, it's indifferent to us in a sense.
It's indifferent. Thank you. Yes, yes. And that flows from this sense too that the outside world is a sort of machine, right? Operating in a mechanistic way, a kind of deterministic way, um, and it may be even this is what starts to crop up is maybe even what's going on in my interior subjective life is determined, right? That's maybe one of the great fears and worries of a secular age. But it's a world that works like a machine in an orderly way that's vast, indifferent to us, that we are navigating through. And because it works like a machine, and this is a phrase that goes back to Max Weber, but it's one that's very important for Taylor. It's a disenchanted universe. It is a universe without multiple layers of reality or being, but it's flat, right? Everything is ultimately reducible to um, subatomic processes. Now we know that contemporary physics is showing us that there's a lot of complexity at the subatomic level, and things are much weirder than we've ever imagined. But I think our general operating perspective still is highly mechanistic, right? That's how most of us go through the world. We don't think in terms of quantum mechanics, for instance. So it's a world without magic, in a sense. It's a world that's spiritually denuded. It is a world that is a machine, and we are in that machine.
And there's no ghost in that machine.
And there's no ghost in that machine. That's right. Um, it and everything can be reduced to the material, to the physical, right? That's all that there is. Um, this is, and it's a very complicated and complex story that we'll try to get into over the coming weeks of how we got exactly to this, but that this is kind of the surrounding environment. This is the mall that the autonomous, buffered, authentic self is trying to make its way through. A cold, vast, deterministic, disenchanted, flattened reality. It's a very uninteresting mall.
Yeah, well, but it's a mall that's got Madonna playing over the sound system, singing, we're living in a material world, and I'm
Right.
a material girl, right?
Exactly,
Uh,
right.
yeah, and I want to say just a quick something about this disenchantment thing. So one of the new atheists, called those four that were called the four horsemen of the new atheism, the philosopher of the group, Daniel Dennett. I've heard him talk about how he has a friend who's a magician, uh,
Mm.
And his magician friend often has people ask him, is that real magic or just illusions? And of course, Dennett's point is that of course it's just illusions, but that's all that there is. That's real magic. What people call real magic is it doesn't exist. It's not real, right? This is important for him, that it's important to recognize that the real magic is just prestidigitation. It's just the trick of the eye or whatever. That the idea of there being a real magic that's real is that's really magical is well, that's not right. I mean, and that is an example of this disenchanted world in which we find ourselves. Is that the real magic is just the prestidigitation. It's the illusion. Uh, it's the
Because
sleight
at
of
the end of
hand.
the day, it's all material processes, right?
That's right.
It's all atoms interacting. It's matter and energy uh, being interchanged. It is not a rich or substantive or robust sense of reality. It is a flattened sense of reality. That's the way you want to visualize it. There's nothing else there. There are no other dimensions beyond the material to reality.
Right. I remember, you know, I remember flying over to England to deliver a paper on the soul, the
Mm,
paper that ended up getting expanded into the chapter in
right.
that book. Um, and I was getting off the airplane at Heathrow, and I have to tell them why I'm there. Why is this American showing up? And I said, well, I'm here to deliver a paper at a conference. And I get the question, what's the conference on? Well, the conference is on the soul. And just kind of the look in the airport worker's eye, and he's like, so they're still having conferences on that kind of thing, huh? He was just, he was incredible. He could not believe it, that would be something, and at Oxford no less, right? That they would have a conference on the soul and people would be delivering papers on that.
Because what is the soul for the secular age? It's simply a word we use to talk about this manifestation of brain activity that we call consciousness or whatever.
That's right.
It's a placeholder. It's not referring to anything else in a kind of substantive way.
That's right. I mean, and I mentioned Dennett. Of course, Dennett's most famous book is Consciousness Explained, and the joke is that its real title should have been Consciousness Explained Away, because basically he says you don't have consciousness,
Right,
and
right.
which is not really fair to him, but it is certainly true of a lot of other folks who've written on the topic, and you see even in someone like William James, the American philosopher and psychologist of the 19th century, um, who was very influential, wrote varieties of religious experience and such, was an atheist. Even for someone like James, he said, soul, I mean, eventually we'll do away with the word consciousness. It's just the language of folk psychology. And once we really understand how the brain works as a functioning machine, biological machine, we won't need words like consciousness anymore. And so it's disenchantment doesn't just mean that when you look out in your yard or in a the woods behind your house or whatever, you don't see fairies anymore. You don't see the fairy folk, or you don't see angels in the sky. It's not just that. It's not just that you don't believe your house is haunted when you hear creaks at night. It's even that you don't believe that there's any magic of consciousness, right? You don't believe that there's, as you were pointing out, Justin, you don't believe there's a layer of reality that's irreducible to the material, a layer or an aspect of reality that cannot be described and explained away by science. So this is the assumption that all there is whatever science can explain, and whatever science can explain is all there really is. And that may be for some an extreme view that might not feel right to you, and yet it operates under so much of our kind of cultural assumptions. Even if you say, well, I'm not so sure about that, because I remember, cousin so and so had an experience of the ghost of Granny one time, or or something, and that seems kind of real, but there's that tension there, that tension. So maybe we can talk about some of the tensions that exist in this map, some of these fissures or tensions
Yeah.
within the map of the secular.
I think one that you've already put your finger on, but it's really important, is that this thing consciousness, whatever it's like to be me, right? We don't really know how to talk about this thing exactly. We certainly don't have um, scientific ways of reducing it at this point simply to brain activity. That's the great quest that many neuroscientists would like to achieve, but they've been unable to do that, and finding, in fact, that it's of greater complexity than maybe they first imagined. So, one way of thinking about this would be, even Nick, if I put you in an MRI and I looked at all the different areas of your brain lighting up from blood moving around as I, ask you different questions and so forth, I could maybe say, well, when I asked you this question, this thing happened, and when I asked you this question, but there's a whole segment there that, as I'm doing that scientific analysis, I'm not really getting at, which is, well, what did it feel like? What was it like to have that question asked of you? What was that sort of experience? What do we call that? Qualia, right, is the term that's often used, but that's just a fancy word. It's just that, what is that subjective experience? And that seems to be part of reality, right? That is out there, but can't be accounted for scientifically. So this seems to be a problem with the map. It doesn't really seem to get that, to know how to explain that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so the qualia issue, as you say, that what does it feel like to be conscious? But I mean, there's also the fact that just because you see neural activity, synapses firing in one area of the brain every time I think about, say, ice cream cones or whatever,
Right.
doesn't mean that the thought is reducible to the synapses. That would be to confuse causation with correlation. All you can really say from an objective perspective, if that's what you want to claim to have, is that there's a correlation between this thought or this behavior as reported by me, this thought is reported by me, or this behavior I do, and this synaptic activity, this neural activity in my brain. Sometimes that's elided. I mean, sometimes people just run roughshod over that and assume causation because they assume that it's all got to be material.
Well, and along those lines, you mentioned David Hume. What I find particularly brilliant in his writing is how he shows that something like causality is an inference of our mind and is not necessarily something that even exists in the world, right? If you want to look at it from just a philosophical point of view, a scientist can never actually say that A causes B, or that this phenomenon causes this phenomenon. All they can see are correlations, patterns, repetitions in nature. But we never actually see one thing cause another thing. We see an event happen in time and space, and another event happen in time and space following it in some sense. And we see those patterns over and over again. And then our brain says, oh, well, this thing must have caused this thing. So the very bedrock of science, which is often seen as kind of the only way towards truth in a secular age, its very foundation is a kind of assumption about the world. It's an unprovable assumption. Or maybe even an inference that our brains, our minds create. So that seems to be a significant problem for science too, and for that mode of truth. That the very heart of it is, uncertain. Right? It's an uncertain foundation.
Yeah, I'm right. And so, I mean, that gets to, I think, a deeper issue that is, I mean, in some sense, you can say that the modern philosophical problem has been and continues to be, I'm going to use a fancy $3 word here, but the epistemological problem. If we are buffered selves, if it's all in us, how do we know that anything that we think about the world is true?
Right. How do we know we're not in the matrix?
Right. How do we know we're not in the matrix? That's it. This is the problem that has plagued modernity. This is the problem that's plagued our secular age. And what you mentioned about kind of the limits of science come up with that. one of the ways that we've tried to avoid this, if we buy into, well, okay, somehow science gets around all these philosophical problems, which is debatable, but let's say that.
Yeah.
Then what about all the stuff that science doesn't address? Like, like you said, the experience of things, the experience of, say my love for my child, that's something that, science is not going to, really be, I mean, you can give some kind of,
This is what's going on in your brain
this is
chemically,
what's going on
and
in
these
your brain,
neurons
right?
but what
Right.
is that experience? That's
Right.
subjective.
And you can give like an evolutionary reason for why I should have strong feelings for my own child, obviously, and you can get into Dawkins's selfish gene here. My genes just want to propagate or whatever. All of that being said, it still doesn't get to the experience, as you say, of
Right.
my love for my child. And so what we often do is try and make a dichotomy between fact and value. And we'll say stuff like, for example, science deals with facts, and religion or whatever deals with questions of meaning or value. I think this is actually not very helpful. Um, but it certainly appeals to that authentic self again, right? Because I'm going to project or imbue things with their meaning, with their value, and maybe we can get together and all agree, if we can bring out that dollar bill again that neither one of us have. We like to say stuff like, well, this is just a piece of paper, but we all agree to imbue it with meaning and value and such. Well, okay, but I can't opt out of that. It's still going to have that meaning and value whether I agree to that or not. And I also think the theologian Stanley Hauerwas will use this example. There's it's the Groucho Marx example. Groucho Marx didn't want to be a member of a country club that would have him as a member. How meaningful can something be if you're the one who created the meaning? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's a little bit like dinner cooked by someone else always tastes better. I mean, that's just a fact of nature. That's a law of the universe, right?
And so it creates a kind of existential anxiety, doesn't it? Right? As you're making your own meaning, your own significance, and I think this is something we'll want to talk about. You see other people are making meaning and significance in different ways. Taylor uses this term, fragilization. Your meaning making is fragilized. It's not very sturdy, right? Because as you're saying, it kind of is coming from you, right? It's your imposition on the world, and you're seeing other people are doing it differently, and you think, maybe maybe this isn't very good
this is
meaning.
good or
Right,
or true.
right.
This is just maybe I came up with the meaning for this on a bad day, and I don't want it to mean that anymore.
And I think lastly, the thing we want to highlight in terms of the mall and the surroundings, right, is that if the materialistic framework is correct, if all reality really is just the material and it's very flattened, it seems to suggest a deterministic universe, right, where we are determined and shaped by causal forces prior to ourselves. And in a way, that is a nullification of agency, of choice, of freedom. And yet we've been talking about how in the secular age, choice and choosing your life and constructing an authentic self is so important, right? It is in some ways what fulfillment means in a secular age. And yet maybe you can't. Maybe what you become is simply a result of these deterministic forces. And so you're really not being authentic in the sense of choosing for yourself, right? And this is the tension. Can you really have authenticity in that sense in a secular age?
Well, so we've looked at some of the problems, some of the
Yeah.
fissures, some of the issues. I think maybe before we wrap this up,
Yeah.
we got to take a second to talk about religion
Yeah.
and how does God fit into all of this?
Right.
Is God just cast out? We know that's not true because we wouldn't have jobs if that were true. Um, but we also know that um, our denomination, along with most other denominations, are in decline right now. Uh, One of the things that Taylor says is that a way of thinking about this change, this ratchet point at about 1500, where you really move into a secular age, is that before 1500, it was really hard, if not nearly impossible, to not believe in God. You don't find a whole bunch of atheists in medieval Christendom. Uh, or even, I mean, you'll find some more, but you still don't find a whole lot even in the ancient world, in ancient paganism, for example, certainly not in ancient Judaism or ancient Christianity. Uh, but after 1500, it becomes increasingly more difficult to hold on to a belief in God. It's not as if there's no reason to believe in God. It's not as if you can't believe in God. But it's simply no longer the taken for granted position.
Right.
God is not just there. Now, if you want to assert God's existence and you want to believe in it, well, one, this is typically privatized to just your personal belief and opinion.
You do whatever you want in your own time, kind of thing.
Right. You do you. Uh,
Right.
it, you know, and so we tend as a culture to kind of look askance at attempts to revive those ancient and medieval proofs for the existence of God, and without even addressing them, often we simply dismiss them and say, well, certainly they can't do what they claim to do. It's not even a question. We don't even, and
And
we
what's interesting, this is so relevant to our discussion, Nick. I think what's interesting, you use the word proof, right? But in fact, that's not what the medieval theologians even thought they were doing, right? The idea of trying to prove God's existence already, in a sense, shows that intuitively it's difficult to believe in God. It's not just the natural default, right? For them, these were more, as Anselm famously said, faith seeking understanding. This is sort of an attempt to understand God at a deeper level, and the rational necessity for God, for instance, if you take something like the ontological argument. Um, and so it's a clear framework difference. We wouldn't use the word proof. They wouldn't use the word proof, but rather we would use the word proof, because that's how people today think about those arguments, right? That they're rational demonstrations of something that's hard to believe, and you need something solid to ground it on. I think that's a clear sign that we're living in, a secular age.
Sure, and when in certain circumstances you do see them use the word proof, they're using it in the same way Euclid, for example, uses proof.
Right.
What's the proof that two parallel lines never meet? Right.
Right.
It's not as if it's not proof in the sense of scientific proof. That's not
Right.
the way the word is
Right.
used there. But yeah, that's a great point. So religion becomes privatized. It's all about your personal beliefs. We
Mm.
don't accept. I mean, it's interesting to me that you know, folks like Kurt Gödel actually came up with an updated form of the ontological argument using mathematics. You never hear about that, right? Or the fact that John von Neumann told his mother that there's more reasons to believe in God than not to believe in God. You know, these are great heroes of folks like the New Atheists, and they conveniently leave those those bits of the story out. Because we don't want to hear that, right? You know, if you believe in God, that's fine, but it's just your personal opinion, and it can't carry any more weight than that in our secular age.
Right.
Another thing that happens, and this might be the last thing I'll say about this, and then if you want to kind of add anything or take it in a slightly different direction. But one of the things that happens is God is clearly not on the map. So when we're standing at the kiosk in the mall and we see that you are here and we see, there's no place for God there, right? There's no chapel in the mall, and so if you want to believe, that's fine. You can believe, but you know, here you're essentially given three options. Now, we're going to talk about why these three options are not actually the only three options and why they don't fit before 1500. But we're going to have to talk about that later in a later session. For now, just know that the three options that we're given in our secular age, if you decide you want to believe in God, which you're free to do, you know, it's your personal opinion. Your God is you know, so either you're an atheist, you don't believe in God, or your God is the deist God. This is the God of the founding fathers of this nation. You know, a
Thomas
God.
Jefferson.
Yeah, right. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin. I mean, they're all kind of on this. They've all gotten on this boat. But anyway, this is the God who is a great watchmaker. He makes the machine. He creates the material reality that is this machine. He gets it going, and then he lets it go.
So we would say in our updated cosmology, he starts the Big Bang, or he's the source of the Big Bang, and then the universe kind of unfolds on its own, and God has no real involvement in it.
That's right. The most that you might say, and this is like the founding fathers of our nation, you might be a providential deist and say there's an end to which it's moving that he's intended. But but it's still unfolding on its own. It's going to get there on its own. It's, you know, you set up the tracks for the toy train, and you know where the train's going to end up, but you're not pushing it along. You know, it's moving. It's a locomotive. It's moving on its own. In this case, from battery power, but whatever. And so that's one option. The other option, the only other option we're told is the interventionist God. And this is just like the deist God, except that every time he sees something he doesn't like or wants to change in the unfolding of creation, you know, he tinkers with it. He steps in, he does something to change it. And or, you know, perhaps he listens to someone's prayer and he decides, okay, in this case I'll answer Justin's prayer, and I'll make sure that there's a free parking spot for him at, you know, the Shenandoah Joe's, so he can get his coffee, you know, or whatever. You know, there's that's what he does. He tinkers. He's an interventionist God. And so you have to choose, if you're going to believe in God, do you believe in the deist God? Do you believe in the interventionist God? You may end up saying, like Nick Cave in that one song from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, I don't believe in an interventionist God, but baby, I know that you do. Anyway.
And this is where we get the idea of miracles, right? You know, as this term is used in contemporary life, a miracle is a kind of break in the normal mechanistic order, intervention from the outside, you know, a deus ex machina, God outside of the machine doing something, changing the normal order of things. This is what we think a miracle means, right? This is how it's often defined. And this is very much an understanding of God that grows out of a secular age.
Well, let's if it's okay with you, Justin, I think we've taken up enough time. Let's go ahead and wrap it up there, and I look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday for the discussion. If you show up for that, we'll be sending the Zoom link out along with this video, Justin to the folks at St. Paul's Ivy, and I'll be sending it to the folks at Fort Church. And it's also available to anybody who stumbles across this video. If you watch the video in time and want to join the conversation, we'll post up the Zoom link for you too, so that you can do that.
Let me just say in conclusion, thank you, Nick, for the conversation today. I think it was very helpful, and it was enjoyable. And this is hard stuff. Potentially, this is challenging stuff. These are ideas maybe that you don't quite yet know or fully understand, and that's why we want to also do these Wednesday sessions to kind of unpack what we've talked about in the video before. So if you have questions, please bring them to that session, and we'll be happy to discuss.
Absolutely, and you can also post questions in the comments, and
Yeah.
and we'll try and address those. If you're not at the Zoom session, try and maybe get to some of those as part of our forthcoming sessions. But anyway, thanks, Justin, and I look forward to seeing you Wednesday.
Thank you, Nick.